Good afternoon, families, and welcome to our Family Friday webinar this Thursday. My name is Lydia Suit, and I am a graduate intern for Parent and Family Programs this summer. I am really excited tonight that we're joined by Tiffany Christian, our Director for Student Accessibility Services. Tiffany will start off with a presentation about 20 to 25 minutes about student accessibility services, and then we'll have some time for questions. We've realized that the best way for y'all to communicate your questions is through the Q&A chat at the bottom of Zoom. So you can see that feature down at the bottom of Zoom, and you can type your questions in there as they come up through the presentation or as we start to have our discussion at the end. It'll be hard to monitor the chat, so we really recommend putting those questions in there. And with that, I will go ahead and hand things over to Tiffany. Welcome, Tiffany.
Thanks, Lydia. One second. Can everyone see my screen? Hopefully. Perfect.
You're good.
Awesome. Thanks, Lydia. First of all, thank you everyone for coming and joining us today. I do want to apologize in advance. I'm right on that cusp of losing my voice. So I have a throat drop in and I apologize if I need to mute myself to grab a sip of water or to cough. But I'm super excited to have you join us this afternoon. To get us started, I'd love to introduce you to our office here at Student Accessibility Services. So again, I'm Tiffany Christian, I'm the director. Marissa Nichols has joined us as our assistant director at the beginning of this month. Marissa joins us from K through 12, local here in Williamsburg, and we're really excited to have her here with us as a part of our team. Sabrina Willis has been with us for the past 2 years as a graduate assistant and is currently serving as a postgraduate intern for our office this summer. And then Alyssa Rovder is our graduate assistant for next year. She'll be in charge of sort of our testing center and our testing operations. So any students who might have testing accommodations and are electing to test with us, they'll likely be engaged. They'll likely be engaging in conversations with Alyssa. And then Chelsea Smoot is our amazing admin coordinator. She's our front line, so she's oftentimes fielding those initial phone calls, email responses, responding back to families and their students as quickly as possible. Right now, we are in Campus Center 110. By the time we welcome your students here on campus, we will have just moved to this amazing, beautiful new space in the Sadler Center. So that will be on the first floor, directly across the street from, or walkway rather, from the Student Health Center and Wellness Center. Sort of tucked behind the football stadium. So we are really excited to welcome your students to join us this fall as we move into this incredible new space that we're so excited to showcase for our students. And we'll really be right there in the middle of campus, in the middle of everything. So I want to talk a little bit first and introduce to you the students that our office works with to support. So we're working with students who have significant documented disabilities, and other times students who have maybe significant flare-up conditions or diagnoses that when they flare, they'll significantly impact a major life function or activity. So those functions such as breathing or walking, eating, sometimes, or activities such as studying, exercising, those sorts of things. So those big flare-up conditions. And we'll also work with students on a temporary disability. Our most common sort of temporary disabilities would be students who might have a concussion, a student who might have a surgery, whether planned or unplanned. And then also, you know, the natural broken bone sort of thing that might happen as a student's engaging in campus activities through campus rec or other opportunities here on campus. One of the things that our office does not support with or cover in those temporary disabilities, those would be things such as the flu, COVID, mono. There's actually other processes within the university that help address those challenges that students might face during those different types of illnesses. So if students do reach out to us, we'll be sure to direct them in to the appropriate office that will be able to support them through those, again, temporary disabilities, but they're not working directly through our office. Okay, so why do we do it? Our office is really working to foster student independence. We're working and assisting our students in self-determination. I'll talk a little bit about this in a couple slides. We're really emphasizing empowerment and accommodation over limitation, right? So we're not focusing on what I can't do, but rather we're focusing on what can I do with maybe some appropriate accommodations in place. In short, we're striving to create a comprehensive, accessible environment where students are viewed on what they contribute, not on what they're unable to contribute. So the nitty gritty, what do we do? So we coordinate over 3,000 different accommodations every semester. So again, these are reasonable, either academic accommodations, residential accommodations, transportation accommodations. And what we're doing is we're ensuring a student's ability to access those programs or activities. All of these are done on an individual and flexible basis. And it's very realistic that the experience that you have working with our office and our team is going to feel slightly different than what you might have experienced when your student was in high school and going through the accommodation process. And that's because it should. The difference is basically comes down to we're covered by two separate different laws. So in the K through 12 setting, IDEA is the law that governs those students, right? So that's every student has equal access. Every student has access to a free and appropriate public education, right? In higher education, we're covered by the ADA or Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. And that's really geared towards equal access. So the difference between student success and student access is a lot of times what students will say, this feels different. And it is because the laws that govern us are slightly different as well. To our parents and guardians, the process will feel very different as well. So in K through 12, the process of the accommodations are led by the schools, and guardians and parents are very heavily involved. In higher education, post-secondary education, the process is led to students. So we're in K through 12, schools were sort of seeking and finding those individuals who need sort of accommodations or could benefit from accommodations. In higher education, it's really that self-determination, right? The student to say, I have a significant disability or a diagnosed condition. I'm going to come and ask for those accommodations. So that's where the student determination and the process is being led by our students. The documentation standards and the scales that are used for various types of documentation are different. One of the most obvious is, right, in K through 12 settings, scales that are used are generally the children's scale. For a majority of our students, once they reach higher education, updated documentation, testing that might be done, those students will be compared to the adult scales. And those reports and those new scales are very helpful for our office as they're helping us to determine where's the student's current functioning based on their diagnosis or disability, right? Not what was it when they were in third grade based on a children's scale, but compared to the average adult, where do they fall now? I touched on this a little bit. So parents and guardians in K through 12, you were very heavily involved. In higher education, you'll be as involved as your student requests you to be. So you might have noticed some of the communications coming from our office. If you emailed or called in, we're referring back and we're corresponding back to your students. That's because we're helping, right, with this transition. We'll copy you on those emails throughout this summer, but come the fall, we're really going to stop doing that unless a student has copied you initially on those emails, in which case then we'll reply all. But normally speaking, we're going to really start working and focusing on working to support your students. Another difference is actually the implementation of accommodations. So for K through 12, those IEPs or those 504 plans would have traveled from grade to grade with your students, right? The schools then just went ahead and implemented them the next year with the next teachers. In higher education, that's up to the students. So every semester, students will have the ability to say, here are the approved accommodations I have. Which ones would I like to utilize this semester? We definitely have students who will utilize every accommodation every semester. And then we have students who will say, the courses that I'm taking right now don't have any math in it. So I don't need any accommodations to be sent to my faculty members relating maybe dyslexia with numbers, right? That sort of thing. So that's going to be something that, you know, students will do on a semester by semester, and we'll be sure to be communicating those deadlines and expectations to your students as well. In K through 12, a teacher oftentimes will be informed about what the student's specific disability is, and sometimes they'll be taught how to work with that specific disability. That's another big change in higher education. So in higher education, our office will never disclose to a faculty member what a student's diagnosis is or disability is. Rather, we just share with them, these are the accommodations that our office has determined are appropriate. And then the professors will take that accommodation and they'll implement them in those classes. And then the last big difference between K through 12 and higher education is actually the accommodations itself. So one of the more common accommodations that we'll see coming out of out of K through 12 will be accommodations that will also actually change the nature of the assignment. So instead of a 5-page paper, the student only has to do a 2-page paper. So that's what we call altering standards. In higher education, any accommodations that are approved, they need to be determined that they're not fundamentally altering the academic standards of that particular course. So that's where if a student has had an accommodation like that previously, we'll be working with them to find other resources to assist in that process so that they're able to meet those academic standards as accommodations without fundamentally altering those assignments. So many of the accommodations that your student might have received in high school might not be approved here at William & Mary. And when that happens, we'll definitely be talking with your students about why, you know, where that falls in for that student. So what exactly is an accommodation? So an accommodation would be a change or an adjustment to a living or learning environment to provide a student equitable access to our educational programs. We love to use this image, and I apologize if you all have seen this image before, but I think it's a really good visual representation about the different types of accommodations that our office works to provide students. So as you can see in the first picture, each student has been given the same supports and they're being treated equally. Obviously, the youngest student is still not able to see over the fence into the game. The second picture shows different supports being given to each unique student so that they can be treated equitably. And here you can see that all 3 students are now able to see the game. And then the third picture is where the barrier that was prohibiting the smallest student from actually seeing the game is actually removed. So here at William & Mary, we do, when we're talking about accommodations, we're talking about the second and third picture. So sometimes we're unable to remove the barrier, right? William & Mary is a historic campus. We have these beautiful brick pathways all over campus. Those brick pathways sometimes are very challenging for students who might have a mobility impairment. So that's an example of a barrier that we're unable to remove. So what are appropriate accommodations or supports that we can provide to those students so they're still able to navigate campus effectively? So our office has and provides 3 main types of accommodations that fall into these buckets. The first is academic accommodations. So these are anything from classroom accommodations, accommodations related to notes or assistive technology to help a student with their note-taking processing, and then also testing accommodations, so extended time, maybe a reduced distraction environment. We also have residential accommodations. So these could be room-specific accommodations, such as a room that's wheelchair accessible. They can be location-specific, so that could be campus location or residence hall location. So for example, few or no stairs might be a location-specific residential accommodation. We also work with students who require animal assistance. And then also we work with students who have significant disabilities that might require air conditioning if they're unable to select into a residence hall that already has air conditioning in it. And then sort of our last bucket of accommodations that our office provides would be transportation related accommodations. So this would be our limited mobility shuttle service, which would help students with temporary disabilities, maybe navigate campus if they're on crutches, that sort of thing. And then various parking accommodations as well. Sometimes we're asked, hey, can we see a list of your accommodations that your office provides? This is really the buckets that we come back to. Our office has over 350 different unique accommodations. And so that would be sort of overwhelming to a student and or a family. And since those are constantly changing and evolving, we really focus on, okay, which bucket are we talking about, or which buckets? And then we'll dive down with the students to talk about specifically where are the barriers that they're experiencing, or that they expect that they might be experiencing once they join us here on campus, and then what are appropriate accommodations to address those barriers. So some of your students might have already gone through our accommodation process if they were working with us regarding or related to housing accommodations. Other students might just be about to begin that process with us regarding academic accommodations. So our process is pretty straightforward. First, a student will formally submit their registration through Accommodate. They'll provide documentation from a healthcare professional. They'll meet with a member of our staff. And then they'll receive communication from our office after those meetings. And lastly, if it's an academic accommodation, there's faculty communication we encourage students to have for the implementation. So I'll go into a little bit more detail about each of these steps in the process so that if your students have questions as they're working with us, you're able to help answer some of those questions. So registering in Accommodate, a student will provide a written narrative sort of answering two questions. How does their disability impact them in a living environment? And how does their disability impact them in a learning environment? Those sort of buckets that I talked about, academic, residential, or transportation related, they'll say yes or no, that I'd like to discuss some of these, and they'll provide a little bit more information about, maybe I have challenges with my note-taking in class because every time someone rustles a paper, I get distracted and it takes 15 seconds for me to refocus on what's going on. So as much information as your students are feeling comfortable sharing, we do love to have that information in that written form. And then students provide their medical documentation from their healthcare providers as well. That can either be uploaded to a student's Accommodate portal, or it can be sent to our office via fax or email, and we can attach it to the student's Accommodate portal for them. The documentation that we accept must cover all of these different criteria. It's important to know that each of these carries different weight for our office. We also will accept psychoed evaluations that might have taken place in high school, as that will provide a lot of information about, what tests were administered, what were the findings of the test, what were significant in the tests as well. So if all you have are those formal evaluations, a neuropsych or a psychoed or even a psych eval, that's fine, send those in. And again, we'll really be looking at what scales were being used, how recent is the information, so that we can best guide our conversations with our students. The meetings with our staff, we start off pretty broad, right? We acknowledge that a lot of times we're the first person, first administrator that your students will be working with here at William and Mary. So we'll ask them, some questions just to get the conversation flowing. What are they excited about? What are maybe they nervous about? And then we'll really start to dive in a little bit deeper, talking about their disability. How are they impacted? Tell me about a time when you might have experienced something along these lines. And what we're really trying to do is determine how they're impacted, right? Two students with the exact same diagnoses are going to be impacted and experience those diagnoses very differently. And so what we're trying to do is figure out where a student is challenged so that we can put in place appropriate accommodations to support that, as opposed to you've been diagnosed with ADHD and here are 10 accommodations that might be helpful. That's not the process that our office uses. It's a really individualized, specific appointment or accommodation process. We do hear sometimes that students are nervous about their meetings with us, and that's natural. Again, we do our best to sort of break the ice, get the conversation going, and our team is trained to sometimes know, okay, the student is being challenged here. That's where sometimes we'll ask questions. Is there anyone else that you'd like to invite into the meeting? And if a student's like, yeah, can I go and get my mom or dad or friend? Our answer is always going to be absolutely, right? We'll wait for them to get whatever supports that they might need while they're having that conversation with us. So the post-decision process. So after our staff has met with your student, they can expect to hear back from us via their W&M email. If your student hasn't already started checking this email on a regular basis, now is a great time to start working with them and make sure that they're not missing any emails that might be coming in. And then in each of the letters that they might receive, there'll be more information about how that student can actually implement those accommodations. Again, at the beginning of the meeting, we talked about that self-determination, right? It's up to a student to determine, do I want to utilize this accommodation or not? So when we determine academic accommodations, the first letters always will go just to your students. And then it's up to them to determine, I would like to send these letters to, all of my faculty, and that will be done through the renewal process. Residential accommodations, students participate in that process through the housing selection process. And they'll get to say, okay, I want to select a room that I see, or I'd like to not utilize my housing accommodations, and I would like to defer into a traditional time slot. And then the same with transportation. So either shuttle or parking accommodations, there's separate action items that they'll need to do after that. All of that information will be included in those communications that will be sent to their WM email addresses. So for the first time, your students might be communicating with their faculty members about their academic accommodations, right? This was something previously that the school has done for them. While our office will process the letters and notify the faculty once a student has asked us to do that, it's still upon the student to then go and meet with their faculty member to talk about what those academic accommodations might look like in that particular course. Generally, the timeline that we say is during the add-drop period of each semester. So first 2 weeks of the school, the great first thing is to go and introduce yourself to your faculty member. That doesn't have to be done right after class, right? Faculty will post their office hours. And a lot of times students find that that might be a more comfortable time to go and introduce themselves and say, I'm Tiffany. You might have received my accommodation letter from Student Accessibility Services. I wanted to talk with you about, what are your timelines for me notifying you regarding testing, if I'll be testing with the Watson Testing Lab. And also I wanted to make sure that it's appropriate for me to utilize my laptop since I'll be using a assistive technology to assist with note taking. But I noticed that, computers aren't allowed in your course. And so that's where the conversation really gets started for students. If for some reason they're finding like this is difficult, our office is more than happy to sort of walk through that process with them, to role play with them so that they get used to and comfortable saying those things. But those are also great conversations that you can play through with your students this summer, so that they're feeling ready to have those conversations when they come on campus if they are receiving academic accommodations. Okay, so parents, what's your role? So let's take a quick moment and just have a reflection right now. So think about everything that you've done as you've helped to raise and guide these incredible students that we're so excited to have here on campus this fall. What are some things that have helped them to be as successful as they are? Are they attending therapy sessions? How frequently are they? What about their sleep schedules? Do you remind them every night, hey, it's 11. Maybe it's time to start thinking about going to bed. Are they working on a consistent basis with tutors or coaches, academic coaches maybe? They're helping them with organizational skills or executive functioning. What about their medications? Are you reminding them to take their medications? Are you refilling their prescriptions for them? I really encourage you each to take some time to really reflect and think about what are all the things that we're doing for our students while they're living with us that have allowed them to be successful. Because our next step in the process is, what can we do to help set them up for success here at William and Mary by establishing those same supports? Okay, so this summer, a little bit of homework, which I know you probably weren't expecting to get from me today. I would encourage now is a good time, right, to start identifying what are some Williamsburg support systems that maybe your student has really relied on while they've been at home. This can be anything from local healthcare providers, local doctors. Maybe it's getting involved with a club sport or an intramural sport because they really thrive when they have that structure and that physical activity on a daily basis. Think about the independent living skills that students will be required to have when they come on campus. Do they know how to do their laundry? Do they know how often to do their laundry? Do they consistently wake up on their own? Or are you still helping them to wake up? We talked about this just a minute ago. Do they know how to refill their prescription, right? Do they know what that process is? Have they already worked with the health center to determine if our on-campus pharmacy is going to be able to fill their prescriptions for them? Think about opportunities for students for involvement, right? Do they have a plan on what clubs or organizations they're excited to learn more about, right? What are some things that they're going to do so that they are engaged in our campus community and they're not just retreating back to their room every day, right? Talk through them. We have hundreds of incredible student organizations and different groups that they can be involved on campus and then within the Williamsburg community as well. You probably know some of your students' weaknesses, right? Do they stay up late on social media and then they're lethargic the next day? What about, video games? What are some things and some boundaries that you can help your students to start putting in place for themselves so that when they come to campus, it's not taken to an extreme and we play 2 weeks straight of a video game? And then the last thing that I encourage families to do is to really work on and establish a communication plan. So, right, for mom and dad, this might be your first student coming to college, and there might be a level of nervousness on both the student and as you as a faculty or family member, right? So how often will you be corresponding with your student? How, right? Is it going to be a Friday afternoon phone call or is it going to be text throughout the day? And then also think about, when your student is here, we want to give them space to thrive, but we also want them to know that we're here to continue to support them. So reminders, right? We need to prepare we need, as parents and family members, we need to be prepared that our students will face difficulties. This is the first time that they're going to be on their own for a majority of them, right? It's not always going to be smooth sailings. But what can we do to help them work through those processes, right? Our office is really big on promoting self-advocacy. So a really good rule that I'd like to use is, right, the saying of 3 before me. So what are the 3 things that you've done to try to solve this problem, try to solve this difficulty before you come to me as a mom or a dad or sister, brother, aunt, uncle to help solve the problem, right? We really want our students to try to develop that self-advocacy and self-awareness of what do we need? Can we allow them to problem solve on their own? On campus, we do have a care report system. This is a system that parents, students, faculty members, outside community members can report if they have specific concerns about a student. I think that this will likely be covered during orientation, if I'm not mistaken. Lydia can correct me if that's if I'm wrong about that. But that is something that our Dean of Students office does as well. So if you're like, I'm really concerned, that's an option that you can put in as well. I do like to remind you, right, at the beginning of the meeting, or presentation, I shared that right now we still are including family members in our communications with students. Once they formally are here on campus, that's where we're really going to then be required to ask for passphrase information. So this is something students do. They set up through their personal info. And parents, you'll get that random email that's like, this is your passphrase. Print it, file it, star it, save it, put it in the freezer so that it's there. Because in 3 semesters, when you call our office and I say, Mr. Smith, it's so great to hear from you. I would love to talk to you about Hannah. However, can you please tell me what your passphrase is? I'll need you to be able to share what that passphrase is. Otherwise, not only my office, but as a university, we're only going to be able to talk about general information and not student specific information. So save that passphrase. It's always just a random word. And it's easy to forget or misplace. So make sure that you save that. And then please just remember, if there's an emergency, our office is not an emergency center. So just please call WMPD. They'll be able to help triage and get the appropriate supports in place for your student during that emergency. And Lydia, that was all I had. So I will open it up, I think, for Lydia to moderate any questions that might have come in.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Tiffany, for that presentation. That was a really helpful overview of both your office and the process. So thank you for that. We do have a number of questions that have come in, so we can try to move through them pretty quickly. So starting off, specifically through student accessibility services, are there any supports for students during the class selection process?
So our office actually doesn't handle course selections. Students will begin registering for courses this summer. Freshmen are able to register up to 11 credits, but undergraduate academic affairs is an appropriate office that will help with that process. Students will be assigned a faculty mentor or a faculty advisor once they're here during orientation. That is a great resource for them to help a student with those final sort of course selections during that orientation process.
Awesome, thank you. And I also just want to add, Shelly Lorenzo gave a great webinar on course registration a couple weeks ago, and she talks about some of the supports from the Office of Undergraduate Academic Affairs in that webinar. So thank you, Tiffany. You kind of touched on this a little bit with the transition of parent roles from high school to college, but if a parent is concerned about their student missing communication, what would you recommend? Like, parents may be used to monitoring their students' emails. What would be an appropriate step?
So I will say the communication that our office will have, right? So we'll do a couple different things. once the academic year starts, we send out a newsletter almost every Friday. And so that's a great thing. If you're wondering if your student has checked their inbox lately, you can say, hey, has anything come out in the SAS newsletter lately? Right. And then if they haven't, they're like, oh, I don't know, I haven't checked it. You can say, well, why don't you check it? Right. That's a great sort of backdoor trick for parents. I will say that once a student comes on campus, the William & Mary email, that's the preferred communication from our university. So faculty, staff, that's how we will communicate with students. There is an expectation that they will be checking their emails. So if you're concerned that your student is not checking their email, that would be a great sort of tool tool to be working on this summer, because that will be their expectation when they come on campus.
Thank you, Tiffany. Let's see what we have next. Okay, so if we have a student who has registered for accommodations, maybe when they did that, they didn't see a time available to meet with a staff member and have reached out with no response, kind of what would you recommend for timeline for communication from your office and when to reach back out if a student hasn't heard from y'all?
Yep, so I will say this, when a student registers for their office, there's kind of a few things that happen before a meeting is scheduled, right? So a student has registered, they've submitted documentation. We go through our first level of review, right? We make sure that our documentation is up to standards, that maybe what the student is requesting for, we have documentation about that. If not, we're communicating with them saying, hey, we need additional documentation, or we're missing this or that, whatever that process is. Then once a student has been marked, their file has been marked as complete, we schedule those students in the order that those files are completed. What we have learned in previous semesters is when students just register, students will then cancel, but we won't be able to pull that next student into that next open appointment. So our office actually now does the scheduling for students. And so it could be once their file is complete, they get that notification that their file is complete. It might take a couple weeks until we go ahead and schedule them for that next appointment. We schedule those appointments 1 week at a time to allow students to then cancel appointments. If there's a conflict that they might have, we can then pull and add the next student available, or the next student whose file was completed into that appointment for the next week. And I will say that once a student has received an appointment, we do email them with those appointment details. They'll know who they're meeting with, on what day, at what time, and in what mode or modality, right? So is it a phone conversation, or is it a Zoom conversation? And important to note is that unfortunately, when we call from our office lines, oftentimes those numbers come up as blocked or unknown. So sometimes cell phones will have those blocks on, right? So if an unknown number calls, it immediately goes to voicemail. In those instances, Lydia, we always leave a voicemail, assuming that there's space for the voicemail, if the student's voicemail has been set up, and we'll always call back. But those are great sort of like little checks and balances to make sure that those privacy or blocked calls restrictions are removed. If we say that we're going to call at 11, we're going to call at 11. Maybe it's 11:02, but we'll be calling at right at that time, so the student can know that that's us calling. I wish our numbers didn't come up blocked, and we're working to get that changed. But right now it does come up as a blocked or unknown number.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Tiffany. Okay, so you mentioned that unlike in K through 12, professors will not be told a student's diagnosis. What if a student would like to elect for their faculty member to know their diagnosis? For example, if they have a flare-up condition and may be out for a certain amount of time.
Yeah, so generally speaking, if a student wants to tell a faculty member, we can't tell a student not to share that. I think a lot of times students will come back and say, my faculty member didn't want to know about X, Y, or Z. It's definitely not because the faculty don't care. Our faculty here are incredible, and they work really hard to support our students, but it's actually just their comfort level, right? Mm-hmm. So a good thing that I would encourage the student to ask is say, you know, I would like to share with you a little bit about my condition, are you comfortable if I share that information with you? And then be respectful of what the faculty's determination is. Again, some faculty members will just, defer to SAS, and I'd say, I'd really rather you just work with SAS, and they'll tell me what appropriate accommodations are, and then I'll go from there. And so I would invite students to ask that question first before just coming and sharing that information, because faculty members are not used to that level of disclosure from students.
Helpful, thank you. Okay, so does William and Mary require documentation of disability and requested accommodations to be renewed each year?
So it'll depend, right?
Okay.
So again, depending on the diagnosis or disability that a student might be having, sometimes if it's a new diagnosis or we're trying to figure it out, if accommodations are approved on a temporary basis. And then there's some other types of accommodations that are really behoove us to check in with those students on a semester by semester basis or a year by year basis. So I hate that answer, but yes, it depends. And our office will be in communication with students if there's additional documentation that's needed, or if their accommodations are non-renewable. We work really hard to be as transparent about that process as we can.
Okay. So it depends, but it will be communicated.
Yes.
Awesome. You may not have the answer to these, Tiffany, but we have a couple questions in here about the on-campus pharmacy. For students who receive medication by mail, do you know anything about if that's something the pharmacy could work with, where that should be sent, or would that be a pharmacy question?
I think that is a pharmacy question. I also think if medication is sent directly to the student, that would just go to the student's mailbox, right? They'd go through postal services to pick it up. I know different states have different regulations about what can be sent and what can't be sent. So without knowing what that student's specific medication is, that would be something to consider. Another thing, right? So there are some medications that are pharmacy cannot provide. That's oftentimes a good time to work with your student's doctor and or insurance company that they can oftentimes extend, instead of just being a 30-day supply, they could provide a 90-day supply based on these things. So sometimes it's worth it to sort of go through that process with your insurance so that your student's not then having to figure out, okay, how do I fill a prescription at the CVS, which is right off campus here.
Okay. Another medication question. Are there accommodations for students who require refrigeration of medication, such as insulin?
Yep. So this is actually sort of teetering on that residential rules and regulations. So on the housing residence life website under housing, there's a list of things that students can bring. So every student is permitted to bring a refrigerator or microwave combination to their residence room. That would be something I would encourage students to work with their roommate on. Again, without knowing how much insulin a student might be storing at a time, that might dictate it might be appropriate to have a second refrigerator that's for the sole purpose of storing that student's medication. It might not be. So those would be things to have, those conversations to have with your student's roommate to determine how much space might be needed. But students will have the ability to have their own refrigerators in their residence room. Every dorm also has a dorm or a kitchen. Residence hall will have those kitchens. I would not recommend storing any medication in the residence shared living or kitchens rather.
Okay. Tiffany, I know we had set this to go until 4:45. Do you need to wrap up, or are you good with a couple more questions?
I'm okay with a couple more questions.
Okay, we've got a few more. We won't be able to get to them all, and I'll let you provide contact information at the end. But one of the ones that I think is probably applicable to a number of people, could you talk a little bit more about testing in the Watson Center and what that might look like in the move to Sadler?
Yep. So we are so excited for our new testing center. You can tell by my big old grin. So in our new testing center, we will have the ability to have 27 students testing at the same time. This process will be done through a student's Accommodate portal. They would go in and request a test room booking, and we would slot them into that spot. They will communicate with their faculty member, and then what happens is the faculty member send us their examination. We'll print their examinations, or provide any other accommodations that might be appropriate, so that when the student then comes to their check in for their testing appointment, they would walk into our new space, which is lovely and beautiful, and our proctor would already have their exam materials ready for them on their desk. They would meet them outside of the testing center, let them know which desk they'll be testing at, how much time they have. We'll check in at what point would you like your time warnings, and then we'll bring the student into the testing center.
Great. And one final question, Tiffany. Since this is a multi-step process where students register for accommodations, submit documentation, how can a student check to see if their file is complete and it's time to meet with a staff member? Or if they haven't heard from a staff member, how can they check in on the progress of the process?
Yep, so students can access all of their information through their Accommodate portal. So that link is available on our website. It will sign in with their WM username and password, and they'll be able to see on the left-hand side, right, has their accessibility request been submitted, and then also what documentation has been submitted as well. Unfortunately, the emails that we send to students don't appear there. So, but all of the emails that a student will receive from our office will come from our SAS@wm.edu email account. So those are including the auto-generated emails regarding testing or appointments with our staff. It also includes testing appointment reminders too. But so that's the email that it will come from, is the SAS@wm.edu. And they'll be able to see if there's anything outstanding.
Awesome. So we were able to get through most of the questions, but if people have maybe specific questions, what's the best way to reach out to your office?
Yep, so I can share the easiest way to get a prompt and timely response from us would actually be SAS@wm.edu. I do want to stress our amazing team is working really hard to respond to these requests as soon as possible. As you can imagine, each request that comes in does require a level of research, following up. What do we have? What do we not have? Do we need anything more? So it's not anything that we're sending form responses, that sort of thing. There's a live human that's checking everything and responding to your student. But so SAS@wm.edu is the best email to send. That account is monitored by all the beautiful pictures you saw at the beginning. We all have access to that, and we're all working on that throughout the day. Phone calls are fine as well. The challenge is that most of our team is tied up in student appointments throughout the day. So I might have 7 minutes in between my 2 appointments. That's probably not enough time for me to respond to a phone call, but between 3 appointments, I can respond to that email and provide those answers as well. So SAS@wm.edu, and then know that we will be having sort of that personal interaction with your student if we haven't already.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Tiffany. Yes, so for the few of you who had questions that didn't get answered, if you want to follow up, SAS@wm.edu, and I put that in the chat. Thank you so much, Tiffany, for your time and for that presentation. And I want to thank you everyone who attended this webinar. We're so glad that you were able to join. This webinar will be recorded as well and posted online at the link that I shared in the chat. So if you need to go back and revisit anything that we talked about, that's a great place to do that. So thank you all, and I hope that you have a wonderful evening. Bye, everyone.
Bye.